Therefore, conscript fathers, take thought for yourself, provide for your fatherland, preserve yourself, your wives, your children, and your properties, defend the name and existence of the Roman people, showed the important aspect of the Roman military. Conscription served as a sense of patriotism, a way to defend Rome and the people, to maintain their dignity and as citizens of Rome. This call to arms is for Roman citizens only, to create a sense of uniqueness where non-Romans cannot participate. This creation of a role that only Roman citizens can fulfill created a sense of duty and strong patriotism, but due to different regions that were under control by different people, these massive armies were not united under Rome, but to those commanders of these regions. A nation-state proud of its military might, yet its military units gradually degraded, signifies the falling of the once great republic. As loyalty placed in the wrong hands, changes were disrupted for personal gains, the stage was set for the fall of the Roman Republic. The building of an army in ancient Rome is no small feat. Beyond the challenge of logistic, recruitment, discipline, and deployment of equally important military success, Julius Caesar understood that an army's greatest strength was not simply its numbers, but its loyalty. Rather than rely solely on the authority of the Roman state, Caesar cultivated the personal loyalty of his soldiers by ensuring they are well fed, well paid, and generously rewarded. As Plutarch records, after the triumphs, Caesar gave his soldiers large gifts and entertained the people with banquets and spectacles, feasting them all at one time on 20,000 dining couches. These rewards strengthened morals and reduced the likelihood of mutiny, but they also transformed the Roman army in an institution that served the Republic into that increasingly served the ambitious individuals. Wealth and military success became political tool, allowing powerful generals to challenge the authority of the Senate. This shift of loyalty can be traced back to the Marian reforms of 107 BCE. It is undeniable that the Marian reforms brought changes to improve the Roman military, such as the use of standardized equipment, which created an elite fighting force in the region, but also by recruiting landless citizens into the army. Gaius Marius solved Rome's growing manpower shortage, but also unintentionally changed the relationship between soldiers and the state. Because of the Republic provided limited retirement benefits, soldiers increasingly relied on their commanders for land, pay, and security after their service. Their loyalty therefore shifted away from Rome and towards the generals who could reward them. It is vital to note that in less than 10 years after Marius' reforms were implemented, his new landless recruits were fighting in the streets of Rome and intimidating voters in the voting assemblies. The traditional links between military service and civic duty had begun to break down. Just before moving on, I wanted to note that the Marian reform was named due to the fact that the lack of historical sources, such as Livy and Polybius, as they stopped writing mid-century. This left a gap in which changes were implemented during this time period and were collectively named the Marian Reform. The one thing that we are told quite clearly about him is that in 107 BC, when he raised his first consular army, he broke tradition by accepting volunteers from the proletariat. Polybius' history, already incomplete as we have it, ends, while Livy's continuous narrative, which originally went through the first century, cuts out almost completely on 167 BC, leaving us with just summaries of his work. This political transformation culminated in Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BCE. The crossing itself was not a battle, but it presented one of the most decisive military and political action in Roman history. The point of no return and the physical barriers between the Cisalpine Gaul and Rome, as be seen here in this picture. This famous crossing was also depicted in the painting by Adolphe Yvon, albeit with an exaggerated depiction of death and destruction caused by Julius Caesar. Caesar showed the total domination of the Roman public by the leash on the neck, showing that he is forcing the people to obey his will, or the slavery of Rome and his people, the people that he swore to protect. Whatever the meaning behind this painting, it is important that this march was to ensure his political and personal survival. Also, by law, no general was permitted to bring an army into Rome, as doing so would be considered an act of rebellion against the Republic. Caesar knowingly crossed his boundary with the 13th legion, signaling that political dispute would now be resolved through military force rather than constitutional process. Ultimately, the crossing of the Rubicon symbolizes far more than Caesar's march into Rome. It represents the point at which military tactics and political ambitions became inseparable. The discipline, mobility, and professionalism of the Roman legion made Caesar's campaign possible, but it's the shift in soldiers' loyalty from the Republic to their commander that made it successful. In this way, Rome's greatest military strength also became one of the principles that causes the Republic's downfall. From a military perspective, the crossing also demonstrated the effectiveness of the Roman legion. Each legion functioned as a highly organized and largely self-sufficient fighting force, capable of rapid movement while carrying its own equipment and supplies. This independence allowed Caesar to move with remarkable speed, preventing Pompey from raising and organizing his own forces. Rather than relying on overwhelming numbers, Caesar used mobility, disciplines, and initiative to seize the strategic advantage. Its remaining legion would regroup later, but the speed of its initial advance forced Pompey into retreat before he was fully prepared. However, none of this would have been possible without absolute loyalty of Caesar's soldiers. In theory, their allegiance to a republic would have compelled them to refuse an illegal march into Italy. Instead, years of campaigning together, generous rewards, disciplined trainings, and Caesar's leadership convinced them to follow him. This demonstrated that Roman military tactics extended beyond battlefield formations and weapons. Successful commanders understood that maintaining morale, managing logistics, and inspiring loyalty were strategic advantages just as important as the battlefield maneuvers. And also, in this period, as political violence is a characteristic, and perhaps the most best known features of the urban landscape in Rome after the time of the Gracchi, Julius Caesar was not the first Roman general to exploit his new relationship between politics and military. In 88 BCE, Lucius Cornelius Sulla became the first commander to march his army on Rome, setting a dangerous precedent that political power could be seized through military force. Rather than reforming the military system after Sulla's action, the Republic allowed the problem to persist. Whether through financial limitations or political unwillingness, Rome failed to restore soldiers' loyalty to the state. As a result, personal armies commanded by ambitious generals became increasingly common, fueling civil wars, political instability, and ultimately the collapse of the Roman Republic. Now, to the home front, the most important but usually overlooked when talking about wars and military tactics. But to maintain a stable and highly productive home front contributed directly to the military campaigns by providing manpower, weapons, and supplies. It also impacts morale when soldiers know that their families and farms are safe from intruders. Rome, however, during the Republic, showed certain strengths and weaknesses from both internal and external pressure. Through conquest, the protection of food from farming came mostly from slave and wealthy landowners, which allowed more men to be on campaigns for longer periods. But by expanding too aggressively, the amount of slaves also created instability and mutiny. The lack of troops at home and the ratio of slave to citizen created a very delicate balance that can be broken with the smallest trigger. Of course, military strategy extends beyond commanding troops on the battlefield. It also involves maintaining stability and security on the home front. Following successful campaigns, Roman soldiers were often rewarded with land to settle and farm, while the wealth, booty, and slaves acquired through conquest helped sustain the republic's economy. As citizen soldiers served on military campaigns, laborers increasingly replaced them in agriculture, maintaining food production and supporting Rome's expanding population. Following the devastating civil war, Julius Caesar recognized that military victory alone would not secure Rome. To prevent further division and the collapse of the state, he pursued a policy of reconciliation. Appian recorded that, for he pardoned many of those who had fought against him, and to some he even gave honor and offices besides, as to Brutus and Cassius, both of whom were now praetors. Rather than eliminating his political opponents, Caesar sought to reinstate them into the Roman society, reducing the likelihood of renewed rebellion and strengthening the stability of the republic. Caesar also understood that political legitimacy depended on public support. Appian describes the famous incident during the Lupercalia festival, when Mark Antony repeatedly offered Caesar a royal diadem. Although there was only slight applause when Antony first presented it, the crowd loudly applauded each time Caesar refused the crown. Whether this event was genuine or carefully staged to gauge public opinion, it demonstrated Caesar's awareness that the Roman people remained hostile to the idea of monarchy. By publicly rejecting the diadem, Caesar projected himself as a leader who represented and respected republican tradition and sought to preserve political stability. In this sense, Caesar's military leadership extended beyond the battlefield. He recognized that maintaining domestic orders, reconciling political rivals, and responding to public opinion were essential to securing Rome. A stable home front reduced the risk of internal conflict, allowing the state to sustain its military campaigns while preserving social cohesion. The weakness of Rome's doctrine of compulsory military service did not lie in the principle of conscription itself, but in where its soldiers were drawn from. As Rome expanded, prolonged military campaigns removed large numbers of citizens from their farm, leaving agricultural land neglected. Appian observed that much of the lands lay desolated by war, and that it was temporarily worked by others in exchange for a portion of the harvest. This reveals how military service became normal obligation for Roman citizens, while agricultural production increasingly depended on slave labor. Appian further warned that the race of slaves multiplied throughout the country, while the Italian people dwindled in number and strength, being oppressed by penury, taxes, and military service. Rather than strengthening the republic, the system gradually weakened and overstretched its military resources and manpower. The act of enslaving people was also common practice in ancient time, but for the Roman, it is a chance to prevent other uprising. The intensity of Roman looting cities can be noted in one of the famous Battle of Corinth, where Roman legion took the place which is Corinth apart, looted its fabulous works of art, and enslaved the people and set it ablaze. This was just an exaggerated piece of source that modern historians rarely believe, but it is an example of how Rome dealt with their prisoners of wars. The Third Servile War further exposed the consequences of this imbalance. The sheer number of slaves, combined with absence of citizen soldiers serving on distant campaigns, created conditions where major uprising led by Spartacus. Rome's inability to maintain sufficient military forces on both the frontier and within Italy demonstrated that its resources had been stretched out too thin. This growing dependence on slave labor and professional armies also enabled wealthy and influential generals to cultivate the personal loyalty of the troops. As armies became loyal to individual commanders rather than the republic, figures such as Julius Caesar were able to challenge the authority of the Roman state, contributing significantly to the republic's political instability and the eventual decline. In a different aspect, small farmers and war veterans, unable to compete with wealthy landowners who relied on slave labor, lost their livelihoods. They were being reduced from competence to extreme penury, and from that to childlessness, because they were unable to rear their offspring. They recounted military service they had rendered, by which this very land had been acquired, and were angry that they should be robbed of their share of common property. There is blame on the rich landowners employing slaves, which reduced necessity of freedmen and Roman citizen laborers. This created a political imbalance that Gracchus did not expect when enacting the changes that focuses on increasing laborers of Italian descent and helping poor citizens. It's a problem of money and power came into existence. This land reform created a chain of violence, from non-violence to the veto by Tribune Octavius, the tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE, who used his office and traditional rights as a political tool to support elite vested interests. Both ancient and modern sources have tended to agree that political violence was unleashed in Rome when Tiberius Gracchus, as a tribune of the plebs, and a significant number of his supporters were killed by a group of senators and magistrates, and also their followers, showing the weakness of Roman democracy, where creation of new laws also created internal enemies and the absolute power that the powerful landowners had over the poorer population due to their influence over the patrician and the political officers. Overall, The imbalance in both home front and how the military was managed leads to a series of political and military coups that the Roman Republic are ill prepared for. This leads to instability in both newly conquered areas and at home, showing the fragility of the Republic from its inability to address internal issues and political unrest, leading to its decline and fall.